Morning arrives too soon, grey light seeping through the small window before the family's ready to face what this day might bring. Daniel wakes first, the habitual timing of years at the ironworks embedded in his body despite the short nights. Sleep. For a moment he lies still, watching the familiar cracks in the ceiling, mentally preparing for what's likely waiting at the factory gates. Margaret stirs beside him, immediately alert, as is her custom. Their eyes meet in the dim light, a world of unspoken communication passing between them. No need for words. Both understand exactly what this day represents. "I'll go in as usual," Daniel says quietly. Better to face it directly than wait for them to send someone. Margaret nods. Dignity matters, especially when little else remains under your control. "We'll manage either way." Such simple words to encompass such complicated reality. We'll manage. The working-class mantra that contains within it all the strategizing, sacrificing, and sheer determination required to survive when systems are designed for your exploitation rather than your flourishing. Around them, the tenement begins its daily awakening, the familiar sounds of neighbors preparing for another day of labor. Footsteps on the stairs, water being pumped in the courtyard, children being roused from sleep, the collective stirring of hundreds of people whose labor powers the city's prosperity while they themselves remain on its margins. The Murphy morning. Routine unfolds with practiced efficiency, each person performing their role in the careful choreography of shared space. Thomas dresses quickly for his paper route, adding the shipping office to his day's agenda. Sarah rekindles the small fire in the stove for tea. Grandmother Murphy says her morning prayers from her chair. Daniel and Margaret prepare for their respective workplaces, though both suspect Daniel's preparation may prove unnecessary. Before they disperse for the day, the family pauses for a moment around the small table, sharing tea and bread in near silence. This brief communion, this moment of togetherness before facing individual challenges, serves as both practical nourishment and symbolic affirmation of their interdependence. "I'll walk with you part way," Thomas tells his father as they prepare to leave. It's an unusual offer. Their routes typically diverge immediately, and everyone understands its significance. Thomas wants to be present to witness whatever happens. At the ironworks, to stand with his father in this moment of vulnerability. Daniel hesitates, then nods acceptance. The gesture acknowledges something important. Thomas is no longer simply a child to be protected from harsh realities, but increasingly a partner in the family's navigation of those realities. As father and son depart, Margaret turns to the day's tasks with intensified focus. If Daniel loses his position, every penny becomes even more precious. The extra piecework must be completed perfectly. Additional opportunities must be sought. Resources must be stretched further than seems possible. Help Sarah with the laundry today, Grandmother Murphy offers, sensing Margaret's preoccupation. "My hands aren't too bad this morning. And I can take over the mending," Sarah adds. "You showed me how to patch trouser knees properly last week." These offers, these small redistributions of labor, represent the family's immediate adaptation to crisis. No discussion needed, no elaborate planning, just the automatic rebalancing of responsibilities to address changing circumstances. Outside, Daniel and Thomas walk through streets already busy with morning activity. Neither speaks much, both absorbed in their thoughts about what awaits at the ironworks. The factory's chimneys are visible from blocks away, black smoke signaling another day of production, regardless of individual workers' fates. As they approach the gates, they see an unusual figure waiting. Mr. Sullivan, the foreman from Daniel's department, standing apart from the entering workers. His presence outside rather than at his usual position overseeing the shift startup confirms Daniel's suspicions. This is indeed a termination. "You should go now," Daniel tells Thomas quietly. "No need for you to witness this." Thomas hesitates, clearly reluctant to leave his father facing this moment alone. The shipping office, Daniel reminds him. That's where you're needed today, for the family. This framing, placing Thomas's job seeking in the context of family responsibility, gives the boy permission to leave. With a quick squeeze of his father's shoulder, Thomas continues down the street, glancing back once before turning the corner toward the harbor. Daniel approaches Mr. Sullivan with deliberate dignity, his back straight despite the fatigue of little sleep and the anticipated humiliation of public dismissal. Murphy, Sullivan nods, his expression revealing discomfort with his assigned task. Mr. Harrison wants to see you. This is unexpected. Terminations typically happen at the gate, not in the owner's office. The deviation from standard procedure introduces uncertainty into what had seemed a foregone conclusion. Now? Daniel asks. Now. Sullivan gestures toward the administrative building adjacent to the main factory. I'm to bring you directly. They walk in silence through the iron works yard, passing workers who avert their eyes, recognizing the situation but unwilling to acknowledge it directly. Being singled out by management rarely leads to positive outcomes. The administrative building presents a stark contrast to the factory floor. Quiet, relatively clean, the air breathable rather than choked with smoke and metal dust. Sullivan leads Daniel to a secretary's desk outside Harrison's office. Daniel Murphy to see Mr. Harrison, he informs the young man seated there, then turns to Daniel. Good luck, he says quietly before departing, returning to his proper domain on the factory floor. The secretary disappears into the inner office, returning moments later. Mr. Harrison will see you now. Daniel enters the owner's office with the same dignity he's maintained throughout this process, determined to face whatever comes without revealing vulnerability. The room is luxuriously appointed by the standards of the time: polished wooden desk, leather chairs, oriental carpet, large windows offering natural light that workers on the factory floor rarely experience. Harrison himself stands near these windows, looking out at the factory yard. He's a man in his 50s, his clothing and bearing marking him as unmistakably upper class. He turns as Daniel enters, studying him with clinical interest. Murphy, he says, consulting a paper on his desk. Iron worker, Department 3, 5 years with us. Yes, sir. Daniel stands with his cap in his hands, neither servile nor defiant. Harrison circles his desk, maintaining the physical advantage of his position. You were at Tompkins Square last night. It's not a question, so Daniel doesn't treat it as one. He simply waits for whatever comes next. Labor agitation, Harrison continues. Union talk, demands for changes to established systems. Again, not directly questioning, so Daniel remains silent. This approach, neither confirming nor denying, neither apologizing nor justifying, represents a small but meaningful retention of personal dignity in a profoundly unequal power dynamic. Harrison seems to read his confusion. Don't misunderstand. Murphy, I saw you at that meeting. I know your sympathies, but I also know skilled workers when I see them, and business requires practical decisions, not merely ideological ones. He leans forward slightly. The position comes with conditions, of course. No union activities, no labor organizing, no participation in strikes or work stoppages. Your complete loyalty to company interests. One violation and termination will be immediate and permanent. In a single New York tenement room in the 1880s, a family of 7 might share 400 square feet of living space with no running water, no bathroom, and almost no ventilation. Yet from these cramped, disease-ridden spaces emerged the workforce that transformed America into an industrial giant virtually overnight. So yeah, if these stories help you sleep, hit subscribe so you don't miss any. Comment where you're at in the time, too. Kind of fun seeing all the different places. Someone from Iceland commented once, and I had to Google what time zone that even is. All right, tonight it's the 1880s in America. But hold on, get cozy first. Seriously, take a second. Adjust whatever needs adjusting. You're not going to want to move once we start. The scraping sound of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones pulls Daniel Murphy from sleep before dawn. Before. His eyes even open, His body registers the weight of his youngest child, who crawled into the shared bed during the night. The stifling air in the small tenement room already carries the smell of boiling cabbage and coal smoke from other apartments. His back aches from the thin cornhusk mattress that does little to cushion against the rope bed frame beneath. Unlike the comfortable mattress you're lying on now, this bed offers no comfort, only a slight barrier between a working man and the floor. It's 1882 in New York's Lower East Side, and Daniel has exactly 17 minutes to get himself ready before he needs to leave for the ironworks. 17 minutes to transform from exhausted father to functional machine operator. 17 minutes that will determine whether he earns today's pay or gets replaced by any of the hundreds of desperate men waiting outside the factory gates. Daniel carefully shifts his daughter Sarah back to the pallet she shares with her brother, without waking either of them. The room is small. So small that with a single step, he can touch the wall that separates their living space from the Kowalskis next door. From the other side, he can hear Mrs. Kowalski's chronic cough. Tuberculosis, probably. The disease thrives in these buildings, where sunlight never reaches and air barely circulates. You thinking of getting up any time today? His wife Margaret whispers from the small stove where she's already heating water. Her silhouette barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Was enjoying my luxury accommodations too much? Daniel replies with a quiet laugh, careful not to wake his mother, who sleeps in the room's only chair, her arthritis making a bed impossible. You know what's weird about tenement life? The bizarre intimacy of it. You don't just live with your family. You live with their every sound, smell, and bodily function. And not just your family. The paper-thin walls mean you know exactly when Mr. Rossi from upstairs is fighting with his wife, when the twins on the first floor are sick, and which of your neighbors snore like freight trains. Margaret hands Daniel a chipped cup of what passes for coffee. Mostly chicory with just enough actual coffee to maintain the fiction. It's hot, though, and that's what matters. In the 1880s, that morning cup hit different. It wasn't about flavor profiles or cute barista art. It was fuel. Pure and simple. Thomas already left? Daniel asks, noticing his son's empty sleeping space. Had to. Said something about getting a good corner for the morning edition. Daniel nods. At 16, their son has the hustle that might actually get him somewhere in this new America. Newspaper. Boys who secured prime locations could double their sales. And Thomas has been saving every spare penny. Not for candy or entertainment, mind you. The boy has bigger dreams. Dreams of education that neither Daniel nor Margaret ever had. Looking around their one-room home in the dim light, Daniel takes quick stock of their world. A rope bed shared by him and Margaret. Pallets on the floor for the children. A small stove. A table with 3 mismatched chairs. A trunk containing everything they own that isn't currently being worn or used. And one window that opens not to the street, but to an air shaft so narrow you could touch both sides if you stuck your arms out. You're probably thinking, why would anyone live like this? Well, when the alternative was starving in Ireland after the potato famine or fleeing religious persecution in Eastern Europe, suddenly a cramped tenement in America seemed like winning the lottery. At least here there was the possibility of something better. Maybe not for you, but for your kids. Daniel splashes water on his face from the basin, the same water the whole family will use throughout the day, carried up 5 flights of stairs by Thomas last night. Indoor plumbing? That's for the wealthy folks uptown. Here in the tenements, you're lucky if the shared toilet in the backyard isn't overflowing. Fixed your shirt best I could, Margaret says, handing him his work shirt, with newly mended tears where sparks had landed yesterday. The fabric is thin from too many washings, but it's clean. A point of pride for Margaret, who refuses to let her family look like they've given up despite the circumstances. You're a miracle worker, he says, feeling the neat stitches with calloused fingers. The skin on his hands is tough as leather now, cracked in places from the constant heat and cold of metal work. Hands that had once worked a small farm in County Cork now manipulated industrial machines that would have seemed like science, fiction to his father. Daniel dresses quickly in the semi-darkness. Privacy is a luxury they can't afford. But they've developed an elaborate choreography of turned backs and averted eyes that creates the illusion of personal space where none exists. I want you to picture this for a second. Your entire life. Sleeping. Eating, bathing, changing clothes, sickness, arguments, affection, all happening in a space about the size of a modern bathroom. No doors to close, no room to retreat to when you need space. Just constant, unrelenting togetherness. Outside, the city is already waking up. The sound of hooves and carriage wheels creates a constant background rumble. Somewhere nearby, a factory whistle pierces the dawn. It's joined moments later by another, then another, until the air is filled with the industrial equivalent of roosters announcing the day. From other apartments, the sounds of waking families seep through the walls, babies crying, a couple arguing. In Italian, someone coughing violently, a man praying in Yiddish. This building houses people from 6 different countries, most of whom can barely communicate with each other except through nods and gestures. Yet, they're bound together by the shared experience of starting over in America. "Take this," Margaret says, pressing a bundle wrapped in cloth into his hands. Lunch, probably bread with a smear of lard if they're lucky. Daniel knows she's skipping her own meal to make sure he has strength for his 12-hour shift. "The Flannery boy came by yesterday," she continues, voice low. "Said they're hiring at the glass factory. Better pay," he says. Daniel grunts. "Better pay because half of them die. Before 40, glass dust in the lungs." He tucks the lunch into his pocket. "We're making it, Maggie. Thomas has his papers route. Sarah helps with your sewing. We've got more than most." "I know." She straightens his collar in a gesture that's part practicality, part affection. "Just thought you should know." This was the constant calculation of working-class life in the 1880s, weighing slightly better pay against increased risk of death or dismemberment. No workers' compensation back then, no health insurance. You got injured on the job? Tough luck, buddy. There's 50 guys outside who'll take your spot before your blood dries on the floor. Daniel kisses his wife quickly, touches his mother's shoulder, gently so as not to wake her, but to feel the reassurance of her steady breathing, and takes one last look at his sleeping children. Then he's out the door, joining the river of humanity flowing down the tenement stairs. The stairwell is its own ecosystem. The smell hits him first, a combination of boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, wet laundry, and the distinct tang of too many. Humans sharing too little space. The steps themselves are worn in the middle, wooden boards sagging from decades of use. One flight down, Mrs. Abramowitz is already sweeping her small patch of landing. She nods at Daniel, their daily acknowledgement that transcends their language barrier. Second floor. The smell of fresh bread as the Reich family prepares for their day, running a small bakery 2 streets over. The aroma makes Daniel's stomach growl, reminding him that yesterday's dinner was thin soup stretched to feed 5 people. Ground floor. Mr. Giannopoulos sits on a stool by the entrance, smoking his pipe. The old Greek seems to never sleep, functioning as an unofficial watchman for the building. He taps his pipe in greeting as Daniel passes. "Cold one at the factory today," he says, one of the few English phrases he's mastered, used regardless of the actual weather or Daniel's destination. "Always is," Daniel replies with a half-smile, completing their daily ritual. And then he's outside, joining the mass of humanity that floods the streets of the Lower East Side each morning. The contrast always hits him like a physical force. Inside the tenement, despite its crowding, there's a certain intimacy. These are people he knows lives intertwined with his own. Outside, it's a churning ocean of strangers, all moving with the same urgent purpose. The street itself is a sensory assault. In 2025, you probably think you know what a busy street sounds like. Honking cars, rumbling buses, the occasional siren. But the noise of an 1880s New York street was different, more organic, more varied, somehow both louder and more textured. There's the clatter of thousands of hooves on cobblestones, the grinding of iron-rimmed wheels, the calls of street vendors already setting up. Hot corn, get your hot corn. The shouts of children who have escaped apartments to play in the gutters, the barking of stray dogs, the mechanical clang from workshops whose doors stand open to the morning air, and the smell. Oh man, the smell. Horse manure everywhere, rotting vegetables from yesterday's market, sewage from overflowing gutters, smoke from 1,000 chimneys, the tang of unwashed bodies packed tightly together. It's like a physical presence, something you move through rather than simply detect. You're thinking, this sounds awful. Why didn't they do something about it? Well, here's the thing. For most people, this was just normal. They didn't know any different. And if you'd grown up with these conditions, you probably wouldn't even notice most of it. As Daniel navigates the crowded street, he passes evidence of the rapid transformation gripping America. On one corner, workers are installing electric streetlights, cutting-edge technology that will gradually replace the gas lamps that have lit the city for decades. Across the street, a new telephone wire is being strung between buildings, part of the growing communication network that's shrinking distances in ways that would have seemed magical just a generation ago. A horse-drawn omnibus rumbles past, packed with passengers headed downtown, while just a block away, construction continues on the elevated railway that will soon carry electric trains above the street traffic. Old and new, existing side by side, in a city reinventing itself daily. 3 blocks from home, Daniel passes a construction site where a new skyscraper is rising, 10 stories tall, an almost unimaginable height made possible by recent advances in steel production and elevator technology. He pauses for a moment, looking up at the skeletal framework. Impressive, isn't it? Daniel turns to find Thomas alongside him, his newspaper bag still full of morning editions. Shouldn't you be selling those? Daniel nods at the papers. Heading there now. Wanted to catch you first. Thomas glances around to make sure no one's listening, then lowers his voice. Mr. Sullivan at the newsstand says there's talk of a strike at the iron works. Daniel's jaw tightens. Strikes are dangerous territory, necessary for better conditions, but often leading to violence and lost jobs. Men have been killed for less. Just talk for now, he says carefully. Don't mention it to your mother. No need to worry her. Thomas nods, understanding the unspoken complexities. At 16, he's already learned to navigate the dangerous waters of labor relations, politics, and survival. Childhood doesn't last long in the tenements. Be careful today, his son says with a seriousness that shouldn't belong to someone so young. Always am. Daniel ruffles his son's hair, a gesture that Thomas would normally protest as too childish. But today, he allows it. Sell all those papers and stay out of trouble. They part ways at the next corner. Thomas headed toward the busier commercial streets where businessmen might buy morning papers. Daniel continuing toward the industrial district where smoke already darkens the morning sky. As he walks, Daniel passes other scenes of daily life in 1880s New York. A group of women lined up at a public water pump, waiting their turn with buckets and containers. Children as young as 6 or 7 headed to factories where they'll work alongside adults for a fraction of the pay. A funeral procession, small and sparse, probably for a child given the size of the coffin. Death is a frequent visitor to the tenements, particularly among the youngest and oldest residents. Near the corner of Orchard and Delancey, a commotion draws his attention. A crowd is gathered around a man standing on a wooden crate, shouting passionately about workers' rights and the need for organization. Daniel slows his pace slightly to listen. "They get rich from your sweat and blood," the man calls out, his accent marking him as another Irish immigrant. "While your children go hungry and your wives work their fingers to the bone, are we not men? Do we not deserve dignity?" Several police officers hover at the edge of the gathering, watching with narrowed eyes. Public speeches like this often And with broken heads and arrests. The speaker knows it too. Daniel can see him constantly scanning the crowd, ready to disappear at the first sign of trouble. One of the policemen makes a move toward the speaker, and like magic, the man vanishes. Into the crowd, which disperses in multiple directions. The dance of protest and suppression performed daily on the streets of industrial America. Daniel picks up his pace. The ironworks won't wait, and being late means being replaced. The crowd's quick dissolution leaves him thinking about the growing labor unrest spreading through American industries. Workers demanding things that seem so basic now. A 10-hour workday instead of 12 or 14. 1 day off per week. Safety measures. Restrictions on child labor. Wild demands, right? Imagine thinking you deserve to work less than 14 hours a day, or that maybe 8-year-olds shouldn't operate heavy machinery. Absolute madness. The industrial district looms ahead, a landscape of brick factories with tall chimneys belching black smoke into the morning sky. The air grows noticeably thicker here, laden with coal dust and chemical smells. Daniel can feel it coating his lungs with each breath. Another small tax on his health that he can't afford to think about. Outside the ironworks, a crowd of men lingers, the desperate ones, hoping for a day's work if someone doesn't show up or gets injured. They watch Daniel with hungry eyes as he approaches the gate, some nodding in recognition, others staring with barely concealed resentment. There, but for the grace of God, go I, he thinks, knowing how easily he could be among them. The factory's whistle screams 6 a.m., just as Daniel reaches the entrance. The sound is physical, vibrating in his chest. The massive doors swing open, and the waiting workers flow inside like a river finding its course. Inside, the ironworks is a vision of industrial hell that Dante himself might have imagined. Massive furnaces glow orange in the dim light, radiating heat that will become unbearable by midday. The ceiling disappears into darkness above, obscured by hanging clouds of smoke and steam. Huge machines, steam hammers, presses, rollers, wait like sleeping monsters to be awakened for the day's work. The noise hits him next, a symphony of industrial production already beginning as the night shift workers finish their tasks. Metal. Striking metal, steam hissing through pipes, the roar of furnaces devouring coal, men shouting to be heard above the din. It's not just loud, it's all-encompassing, making normal conversation impossible, forcing workers to communicate through gestures and shouts. Daniel makes his way to his station, a massive rolling machine that flattens heated iron into sheets. The night shift operator, Mike Donahue, looks exhausted, his face streaked with sweat and grime, eyes red from smoke and lack of sleep. Anything. I should know? Daniel asks, practically shouting to be heard. Mike shakes his head. Same as always. She's running hot on the left side. Watch your hands. He gestures to a spot on his own arm where a bandage peeks out from under his sleeve. Got careless. Won't make that mistake again. That's the thing about factory work in the 1880s. The machines were designed for efficiency, not safety. No guards on moving parts, no emergency shutoffs, no concept of ergonomics. The human body was just another component in the industrial process, and a remarkably cheap one to replace when it broke down. As Mike leaves, Daniel removes his jacket and rolls up his sleeves, revealing forearms mapped with small burns and scars, the occupational signature of an iron worker. He ties a rag around his forehead to catch the sweat that will soon be pouring down his face. Another rag goes around his neck to protect against sparks. It's not much protection, but it's better than nothing. Around him, the day shift takes their positions. Men nod to each other in greeting, saving their breath and voices for when they'll be needed. Many have worked alongside Daniel for years, forming the kind of bond that comes from sharing daily danger. They move with practiced efficiency, checking equipment, adjusting settings, preparing for the day's production quota. At precisely 6:15 a.m., the floor manager's whistle cuts through the mechanical din. In unison, workers activate their machines, and the real symphony begins, a roaring, clanging, hissing celebration of industrial might that will continue unabated for the next 12 hours. Daniel's job requires constant attention. Sheets of iron heated to glowing orange in the furnaces are carried to his rolling machine by two assistants using long tongs. Daniel controls the rollers, adjusting the pressure and speed as the metal passes through, gradually pressing it thinner. With each pass, one moment of distraction could mean crushed fingers or worse. The heat is oppressive. Within an hour, every man on the floor is soaked with sweat. By midday, workers will be drinking gallons of water and still cramping from dehydration. Some factories provide water barrels. The iron works, considered generous by the standards of the time, even adds salt to help workers retain fluids. Many shops weren't so thoughtful. If you wanted water, you brought it yourself or did without. As his body settles into the familiar rhythm of the work, Daniel's mind wanders to his family. Margaret will be heading to the garment workshop where she sews piecework, earning a few extra dollars each week. Sarah, at 12, will clean the apartment, tend to her grandmother, and later help with the sewing Margaret brings home. Thomas will sell papers until mid-afternoon, then perhaps find odd jobs for additional coins. Every member of the family contributing, every penny carefully counted. This was normal for working-class families in the 1880s. The concept of childhood, as a protected time of play and education, existed only for the wealthy. For everyone else, children were economic assets who began contributing to family survival as soon as they were physically capable. The morning progresses in a blur of heat, noise and exertion. Daniel's world narrows to the machine before him, the glowing metal, the movements of his assistants. They establish a rhythm together, maximizing output while minimizing risk. Words become unnecessary. They communicate through nods, gestures, and the occasional shout when needed. Somewhere in the factory there's a cry of pain quickly swallowed by the mechanical noise. No one looks up. No whistle stops the work. Later, they'll learn who was injured and how badly. But for now, the machines demand attention. Production doesn't stop for missing fingers or crushed hands. Think about that for a second. Someone gets seriously injured and work just continues. Not because the other workers don't care, but because stopping isn't an option. Miss your quota, lose your job. In a world with no safety net, unemployment wasn't just an inconvenience. It was potentially a death sentence for your family. By mid-morning, the temperature in the factory is well over 100 degrees. Sweat drips into Daniel's eyes, temporarily blinding him at a crucial moment. He jerks back instinctively, avoiding a serious burn, but catching a small spark on his forearm that leaves yet another mark to join the constellation already there. "Careful!" shouts Patrick, one of his assistants, though the warning comes too late. Daniel nods acknowledgement and returns to his position. No time to dwell on near misses. In the ironworks, like most factories of the era, you're never more than a moment away from disaster. The men who survive are the ones who develop an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, who can sense when something's wrong before they consciously see it. At noon, a whistle signals the brief lunch. Break, 30 minutes to rest, eat and recover enough strength for the afternoon shift. The machines don't fully stop, the furnaces can't be allowed to cool, but production pauses as the first shift of workers steps back from their stations. Daniel finds a relatively cool spot near a partially open window and unwraps Margaret's lunch bundle. Bread with a thin spread of lard, just as he expected, plus an unexpected luxury, a small apple, probably purchased at slight discount due to a bruise on one side. The fruit would have cost at least 2 cents, an extravagance that makes him both grateful and slightly worried about the family budget. As he eats, he observes the factory from this rare moment of stillness. The scale of the operation is impressive. Hundreds of men working in coordinated chaos to transform raw materials into the building blocks of modern America. The iron they produce today might become rails for the expanding railroads, or structural elements for new skyscrapers, or components for the machines that are transforming every aspect of American life. It's strange to think that he, an immigrant, who grew up in rural Ireland, is now part of this industrial revolution. His father had farmed the same small plot for his entire life, using tools and techniques unchanged for centuries. Daniel operates machinery that didn't exist when he was born. His children are growing up in a world being reinvented daily. Progress, they call it. But sitting here surrounded by conditions that crush body and spirit alike, Daniel sometimes wonders about the cost of this progress and who pays it. Before this thought can fully form, the whistle blows again. Lunch break over. Back to the machines for another 6 hours. As he returns to his station, Daniel catches sight of a well-dressed man walking the factory floor, accompanied by the owner, Mr. Harrison. The visitor has the unmistakable look of wealth, fine clothes, clean hands, the confident posture of someone who never worries about his next meal. Probably an investor or business associate being given a tour of the operation that generates his comfortable income. The contrast is stark. The visitor's suit probably cost more than Daniel will earn in months. The gold watch chain visible across his vest represents years of an iron worker's wages. Yet he passes through the hellish conditions of the factory floor with nothing more than a handkerchief pressed occasionally to his nose, his expression a mixture of fascination and faint distaste. This was the reality of the Gilded Age, a thin veneer of spectacular wealth overlaying the harsh conditions that produced it. While industrialists built mansions with dozens of rooms, multiple families crammed into single-room tenements. While the upper class worried about which fork to use at dinner, the working class worried about having dinner at all. The afternoon drags on, each hour feeling longer than the last. As fatigue sets in by 4 p.m., Daniel's arms burn with exhaustion. His back aches from the repetitive motion. Still, the rhythm continues. Still, the iron flows through the rollers. The machine doesn't care about human limitations. Around him, he can see similar strain on his co-workers' faces. Men moving more slowly, making small mistakes that they catch just in time. This is when accidents happen, in these late hours when muscles are weak and attention frays. Daniel forces himself to focus, to check and double-check each movement. At 5:30 p.m., preparations begin for the handover to the night shift. Machines are adjusted, logs updated, critical information passed along. By 6 p.m., as the final whistle blows, Daniel feels hollowed out, his body running on reserves he didn't know he had. As he retrieves his jacket now, Mike Donahue appears again, looking marginally more rested than he had 12 hours earlier. They exchange brief updates about the machine's performance, continuing the unbroken chain of production that runs 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. Outside, the evening air feels shockingly cool after the inferno of the factory floor. Daniel's sweat-soaked clothes cling uncomfortably to his skin, but the air is so polluted with industrial smoke that it barely qualifies as fresh. Still, it's better than what he's been breathing all day, and he fills his lungs gratefully. The streets have a different energy now. The morning's purposeful flow has been replaced by a more complex pattern. Workers heading home mix with people beginning their evening activities. Street vendors hawk hot food to those too tired to cook. Children play in the last light of day. Saloons fill with men seeking brief comfort before heading to crowded homes. Daniel joins the river of humanity, flowing back toward the tenement districts. His body moves automatically, following the familiar route while his mind drifts. 12 hours of mechanized work has left him feeling slightly detached, as though he's observing the world rather than participating in it. This sensation, this emotional numbing, was a common experience for industrial workers. The monotony, the noise, the danger, all combined to create a kind of protective dissociation. You couldn't fully engage with your surroundings for 12 straight hours and maintain your sanity. So you developed the ability to be physically present while mentally elsewhere. As he walks, Daniel passes signs of the transforming nation, a telephone company office with a sign advertising long-distance calls to Boston, a shop window displaying the latest Edison phonograph. A newsboy, not Thomas, shouting headlines about President Arthur's policies and railroad expansions. The America of 1882 exists in a strange liminal space between old and new. Horse-drawn carriages share streets with electric trolleys, gas lamps, stand alongside electric lights. Traditional craftsmen work in the shadows of mechanized factories. It's a nation in the midst of reinventing itself, and the speed of change is both exhilarating and terrifying. The sun is setting as Daniel reaches his neighborhood, casting long shadows between the tenement buildings. The streets here are crowded with evening life, women chatting as they prepare communal meals in the open air to avoid heating their already stifling apartments. Children playing games with improvised toys, old men smoking pipes on stoops. As he climbs the stairs to his family's apartment, Daniel feels the familiar transition from public to private space, though the boundary is far more permeable than... In modern homes, the sounds and smells of dozens of other families permeate the building, creating a complex sensory landscape that is both intrusive and oddly comforting in its familiarity. Opening the door to his family's single room, Daniel finds a scene of domestic activity that contrasts sharply with the industrial hell he spent his day in. Margaret and Sarah sit by the window, taking advantage of the last natural light to work on sewing. Thomas reads aloud from a tattered schoolbook, helping his sister learn the lessons he received in the few years of education he managed before work became necessary. Grandmother Murphy shells peas for dinner, her gnarled fingers moving with surprising dexterity. This moment, this small pocket of family connection amid harsh conditions, this is what it was all for. This is what made the crushing labor and dangerous conditions worthwhile, the chance for something better, if not for himself, then for Thomas and Sarah. "Pa!" Sarah exclaims, jumping up to greet him. "Thomas taught me multiplication today." And just like that, Daniel crosses the threshold between the America of iron and steam and industry into the America of hope and family and possibility. Two worlds that exist simultaneously, each impossible without the other, both part of the complex tapestry that is being woven in this pivotal decade. The sun sets fully behind the crowded skyline of 1882 New York, ending another day in the life of one ordinary family in an extraordinary time. While the Murphys prepare for evening in their tenement room across town, the electric lights begin to glow in the mansions of Fifth Avenue, the same nation but worlds apart. While Daniel operates machines at the ironworks, Margaret Murphy has been awake since 4:30 a.m., preparing for her own labor. By the time the rest of the family stirs, she's already washed her face in the same basin of water they'll all share, pinned her hair tightly, and laid out the day's tasks for Sarah. Now, as the morning fully takes hold, she navigates the crowded streets toward Mrs. Goldstein's garment workshop. Unlike the massive factories that employ hundreds, this is a smaller operation. 20 women crammed into a converted apartment, each hunched over pieces of clothing that will eventually be sold in the fine department stores uptown. The transition from home to workshop is barely noticeable. The same crowding, the same poor ventilation, the same noise, just different people making different things. Inside, the familiar scene greets her. Long tables where women sit shoulder to shoulder, bent over their work, the constant motion of needles and thread, the snip of scissors, the murmur of conversation in a half-dozen languages, English, Yiddish, Italian, German, Polish, Russian, creating a babble that somehow works as a cohesive communication system. "Margaret, over here." Rosa Abramovitz waves from her usual spot. At 19, she's one of the youngest women in the shop, but her fingers fly over the fabric with remarkable speed. She's also one of the few who can move between the various language groups, having picked up bits of each with the quick ear of youth. Mrs. Goldstein, the shop's owner, looks up from examining a finished shirtwaist. "You're late, Mrs. Murphy." "Apologies," Margaret says, though she's actually right on time. This is just part of their daily routine. Mrs. Goldstein acting stern, the workers apologizing for imagined infractions. Everyone playing their roles. The Henderson order must go out today. We need 50 pieces by 4 hours. Mrs. Goldstein points to a pile of pre-cut fabric. Your usual section. Margaret nods and takes her place at the table. Piecework, getting paid by the item rather than the hour, means that every minute counts. No breaks for daydreaming or rest. The faster she sews, the more she earns. Simple as that. Next to her, Rosa chats as they work, her hands never slowing. Did you hear about the fire at Klein's workshop? 3 girls dead, locked doors. They say nobody could get out. Fires were the nightmare of every garment worker. Flammable fabrics, oil from sewing machines, rooms full of lint and dust. Add locked doors, a common practice to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks, and you had the perfect recipe for tragedy. Sarah told me, Margaret replies, remembering her daughter's wide eyes as she related the news. One of them lived in our building. They're saying the Triangle factory has the same conditions. Locked doors, no fire escapes. Rosa's voice drops. Some of the girls are talking about a union. Margaret's fingers falter for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. Unions are dangerous territory, not just because of the risk to jobs, but because of the violence that often follows organizing efforts. Still, something must change. Too many dead girls, too many crushed men, too many children working when they should be learning. Talk is cheap, Margaret says carefully, aware that Mrs. Goldstein might be listening. Action costs. Rosa nods, understanding the unspoken message. They turn their attention fully to the shirtwaists, their fingers working, with mechanical precision. The garment industry in the 1880s was a strange paradox. On one hand, it offered rare employment opportunities for women, providing crucial income for families teetering on the edge of poverty. On the other, it exploited these same women mercilessly. Long hours, poor conditions, minimal pay, and constant risk of injury or death. You know what's wild? A fancy shirtwaist that Margaret might spend an hour making for 15 cents would sell for $3 or more in a department store. That's a 2,000% markup. And if she complained, well, there were 100. More women desperate for her spot. Midway through the morning, the workshop door opens to admit a well-dressed woman. Mrs. Henderson herself, come to check on her order. The contrast between her and the workers is striking. Her dress alone probably cost more than any of these women make in a month. The single feather in her hat might represent a week's groceries for a family of 5. The workers don't pause, but there's a subtle shift in the room's energy. Backs straighten slightly. Hands move a fraction faster. Pride and resentment mingle, in equal measure. Mrs. Henderson glides through the cramped space, examining the work with a critical eye, occasionally stopping to comment on a stitching pattern or color choice. She shows no awareness of the women as people. They might as well be extensions of their sewing machines. The blue trim on the cuffs is lovely, she tells Mrs. Goldstein, fingering a finished piece. My customers will adore it, so fresh for spring. As she passes Margaret's station, Mrs. Henderson pauses, watching the precise movement of the needle. You have a skilled hand, she comments, not speaking directly to Margaret, but about her, as if discussing a particularly clever animal. Thank you, ma'am, Margaret responds, not looking up from her work. I learned as a girl in Ireland. Oh, you speak English quite well. The surprise in Mrs. Henderson's voice reveals her assumption that all immigrant workers are essentially the same. Foreign, uneducated, interchangeable. We speak English in Ireland, ma'am, Margaret says, her tone perfectly respectful, while the words themselves carry a subtle correction. It's our native tongue for many of us. Mrs. Henderson blinks, momentarily confused by this disruption to her worldview, then moves on without further comment. Rosa suppresses a smile beside her. These tiny victories, these moments of quiet dignity, are sometimes all that get them through the day. Across town, Thomas Murphy has secured his preferred corner for selling newspapers. It's a prime location where businessmen emerge from the elevated train station many looking to purchase a morning paper before heading to their offices. Extra, extra, railroad strike violence in Pittsburgh. 5 dead in clash with Pinkertons, Thomas calls out, waving the New York Herald dramatically. The actual headline is significantly less sensational, but no newsboy worth his salt sells papers without a bit of embellishment. His technique works. Several men approach, handing over their pennies in exchange for the latest news. Thomas makes the transactions quickly, careful to maintain the delicate balance of being helpful without appearing servile. Dignity matters, even when you're 16, and selling papers on a street corner. Between customers, he keeps a watchful eye on his surroundings. The street is a complex ecosystem with its own rules and hierarchies. Knowing who to avoid, who to befriend, and who to watch can mean the difference between a profitable day and a dangerous one. There's Officer Sullivan making his rounds, twirling his nightstick. He's generally fair with the newsboys as long as they stay out of trouble. The fruit vendor on the opposite corner who sometimes trades bruised apples for day-old papers. The gang of older boys who control the territory 2 blocks south and demand protection payments from younger kids working their turf. Hey, Irish. Thomas tenses at the call, recognizing the voice of Butch Williams, leader of the Corner Boys, who've been trying to expand their territory northward. Little busy here, Butch, Thomas responds, deliberately turning his attention to a potential customer approaching. Butch saunters closer, flanked by 2 of his regular companions. At 15, he's already developed the hard look of someone who expects life to be a constant battle. This is our corner now. 5 cents a day for you to work here. The businessman who was approaching diverts his path, wanting no part of the brewing confrontation. Thomas sighs internally. This dance again. We've been through this. Sullivan says this corner is fair game for anyone. Take it up with him if you've got a problem. Butch steps closer, his intention clearly intimidation. Sullivan ain't here. Right now, is he? Actually, he is. Thomas spots the officer rounding the corner, his attention immediately drawn to the cluster of boys. Problem here, lads, Sullivan calls out, his Irish brogue thickening as it always does when he's asserting authority. Butch's demeanor transforms instantly. No, sir, officer. Just saying good morning to my friend Thomas here. Awful lot of boys for a simple good. Morning. Sullivan's eyes narrow. Perhaps you'd be better off selling your papers over on Cedar Street. The message is clear. Butch forces a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. Just heading there now, sir. He turns to Thomas, keeping his voice low. This ain't over, Irish. As Butch and his boys retreat, Thomas nods appreciatively to Officer Sullivan. These small alliances are crucial for survival on the streets. A friendly policeman, a sympathetic shopkeeper, the other newsboys who watch your back. No one makes it alone. Thanks, Thomas says simply. Sullivan taps his nightstick against his palm. Your father still at the ironworks? Yes, sir. 3 years now. Good man, your father. Tell him Mike Sullivan says hello. With that, he continues. His patrol. This was the complex web of connections that immigrants created. Irish, looking out for Irish. Italians for Italians. Jews for Jews. Not because of any inherent distrust of others, but because these shared backgrounds created instant understanding. Officer Sullivan didn't need Thomas to explain why selling papers mattered, why territory disputes were serious business, or why a day's lost earnings could mean a family going hungry. He knew because he'd lived it himself, or seen his own family live it. The morning rush begins to thin as 9 o'clock approaches. Thomas does a quick count of his remaining papers and the coins in his pocket. A decent morning, but not exceptional. He'll need to find a new angle for the midday edition if he wants to make his target for the day. Maybe the financial district? For lunch? Or perhaps the ladies shopping on Broadway in the afternoon. Each location has its own rhythm, its own customers, its own approach. Learning these patterns is essential for maximizing sales. A street musician sets up nearby, his violin case open for coins. The simple melodies draw a small crowd, creating a momentary pause in the city's relentless forward motion. Thomas watches, calculating whether the crowd might include potential customers or if he should move to a more profitable location. The musician catches his eye and nods slightly, an acknowledgement between two people trying to make a living on the streets. Thomas returns the nod. No competition here, just different hustles in the same space. This was a key survival skill in 1880s urban America, knowing when to compete and when to cooperate. Resources were scarce, opportunities limited. Those who navigated these waters successfully were those who could read the social landscape accurately and adjust accordingly. Back in the tenement, 12-year-old Sarah Murphy moves through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. With her mother at the garment workshop, her father at the ironworks, and Thomas selling papers, she's effectively in charge of the household until evening. First priority, water. The family's bucket is nearly empty, which means a trip to the public pump in the courtyard. Sarah grabs the bucket and heads downstairs, joining the line of women and children waiting their turn. Ahead of her, Mrs. Petrovich from the third floor argues with Mrs. O'Brien from the second about who was in line first. Behind her, 8-year-old Vinnie Rossi bounces impatiently, his own bucket almost as big as he is. The pump is community theatre, a place where the building's dramas play out daily against the backdrop of this most essential task. "Did you hear about the Flanagan boy?" Mrs. O'Brien's voice carries down the line. "Consumption," they're saying. Doctor gave him 3 months. Tuberculosis, consumption, was the constant specter haunting tenement life. The crowded conditions, poor ventilation, and shared air made it spread like wildfire once it found a foothold. Everyone knew someone who had died of it, and everyone lived in fear of the telltale cough that might signal their own infection. Sarah tries not to think about the fact that Mrs. Kowalski next door has been coughing for months now, about how the sound travels through the thin walls at night, about how much thinner the woman looks each time Sarah sees her. When her turn at the pump finally comes, Sarah works the handle vigorously, filling her bucket with the questionable water that passes for clean in the tenements. It's not the clear, pure water you might imagine. It's slightly cloudy with a faint metallic taste, but it's what they have. Carrying the full bucket back up 5 flights of stairs is a test of strength and balance. Spill too much and it means another trip down. By the time she reaches the apartment, her arms ache, but she's managed to keep most of the precious liquid. Inside, Grandmother Murphy has already begun her own work for the day, mending a pair of Thomas's trousers that have torn at the knee. Her fingers, twisted with arthritis, move slowly but precisely, each stitch placed with care born from decades of practice. "You got the water, good girl," she says without looking up. "Now check on the Kowalskis. Mrs. Kowalski was coughing something fierce in the night." Sarah sets down the bucket and nods. This is another part of tenement life. Neighbors checking on neighbors, creating an informal support network in the absence of official help. She grabs a small jar of the honey that her mother has been saving for just this purpose and heads next door. She knocks softly, then a bit louder when there's no response. Finally, the door opens to reveal Mr. Kowalski, his face haggard from lack of sleep. "Sarah Murphy," she introduces herself unnecessarily. Of course, he knows who she is. "Ma sent honey for Mrs. Kowalski's cough." Mr. Kowalski takes the jar with a nod of thanks. Behind him, Sarah can see Mrs. Kowalski lying on their bed, a thin sheet covering her despite the room's warmth. Her cheeks are flushed with fever, her breathing labored. "The doctor," Sarah begins hesitantly. "Has he $5? Mr. Kowalski says, his accent thick with fatigue and worry. $5 to come. Where I get $5? It's not really a question, and Sarah has no answer to offer. $5 is nearly a week's wages for many workers. The choice between medical care and feeding your family is no choice at all for most. Evening in the tenements has its own rhythm, different from the mechanized cadence of daytime labor. As families reunite in their tiny spaces, the building transforms from a collection of empty rooms to a vibrant, overcrowded hive of humanity. The Murphy apartment is no exception. and by 7 p.m., all 5 family members have returned, filling the small room with movement, conversation, and the mingled smells of bodies that have worked hard in summer heat. 15 papers left over, Thomas announces, emptying his coin pouch onto the table for the family accounting. This daily ritual, pooling the family's earnings, is treated with appropriate solemnity. In an economy where pennies matter, even children understand the weight of financial contribution. Good day, Daniel nods, adding his own pay envelope. Unlike Thomas's loose coins, his wages come in an official packet, his name scrolled on the outside. Inside is exactly $1.75. Today's pay minus the 25 cents automatic deduction for the company store where workers are expected to purchase their tools and supplies. Margaret adds her earnings from the garment shop, plus shows the extra piecework she's brought home. 3 cents each if we can finish them by Friday. Together they count the day's intake. Survival for another day, perhaps a bit extra for the always growing list of necessities. No one mentions how Daniel's pay is 15 cents. Short of last week, no one needs to. The shrinking paycheck could mean anything from reduced orders to a first warning from management who've heard whispers of his interest in the ironworkers' union. Sarah tends the small pot of soup still simmering on the stove, adding the last precious ingredients. A carrot saved from yesterday, a handful of beans soaked since morning, a few scraps of salt pork for flavor. The single room fills with the aroma, triggering a collective stomach growl that breaks the serious mood and sends them all into laughter. Sounds like music, Grandmother Murphy says with a wink. A whole Murphy symphony. This was how you survived the hardship, finding humor in small moments, making lightness where there was none, creating joy from nothing but shared experience, and the human capacity for laughter. Dinner in a tenement was nothing like modern meals. No separate courses, no individual plates, just the communal pot, a loaf of bread, and perhaps a bit of cheese or fruit if times were good. The Murphys eat together, passing a shared spoon for the soup, tearing chunks from the day-old bread that Margaret got at discount from the bakery. Mrs. Kowalski's worse, Sarah reports between bites. Mr. Kowalski says the doctor wants $5 to come. Daniel and Margaret exchange looks loaded with unspoken communication. $5 is impossible, nearly half a week's wages. Yet the Kowalskis are neighbors, and in the tenements, neighborly bonds can be as strong as family. I'll speak with Father Donovan tomorrow, Margaret says finally. The parish sometimes helps with medical needs. Thomas looks up from his soup. I heard St. Vincent's Hospital takes charity cases. Maybe they could go there. Nobody comes back from charity hospitals, Grandmother Murphy mutters. You go in standing and come out lying down, if you know what I mean. She's not entirely wrong. Public hospitals in the 1880s were places of last resort, often understaffed, unhygienic, and overwhelmed. Many saw them as death houses rather than places of healing. Private doctors were expensive, but at least offered the comfort of home treatment. Alice on the second floor, Daniel says slowly. Their eldest is at medical school now. Perhaps he could take a look for practice. Like this was another crucial survival mechanism, knowing who in your community had useful skills or connections. The informal economy of favors and bargains that operated alongside the cash economy, especially among immigrant groups. I'll ask in the morning, Sarah volunteers, already planning her approach. With dinner finished, they transition to evening work. No leisure time here. Every waking hour needs to be productive when margins are so thin. Daniel repairs a loose floorboard that's been catching on Margaret's skirt. Margaret and Grandmother begin work on the extra sewing, their fingers moving, with practiced precision despite the day's accumulated fatigue. Thomas reviews the headlines from today's papers, preparing to share news with the family. This evening ritual of news sharing serves multiple purposes. It keeps the family connected to the wider world beyond their immediate struggles. It helps Thomas practice his reading, and it provides a framework for Daniel and Margaret to impart values and perspectives to their children through discussion of current events. President Arthur gave a speech about civil service reform. Thomas begins. squinting at the small print in the fading light. Says government jobs should go to qualified people, not just friends of politicians. Huh? Daniel can't contain his skeptical reaction. And I'm sure the politicians are falling all over themselves to give up their patronage powers. What's patronage? Sarah asks, looking up from where she's sorting fabric scraps by color. Even the smallest pieces saved for quilting or patching. It's how the world works, little one, Grandmother Murphy answers before Daniel can. Those with power hand out jobs and favors to their friends and family. Always been that way. Doesn't make it right, Daniel counters. Systems rotten through, same in government as in the factories. Those at the top looking out for each other while the rest of us scramble for crumbs. There's an edge to his voice that makes Margaret glance at him sharply. This kind of talk, this questioning of the established order, can be dangerous if carried beyond these walls, especially with union whispers already circulating at the ironworks. What else, Thomas? She asks, deliberately steering the conversation towards safer waters. The Brooklyn Bridge construction continues, Thomas reads. They say it will be the longest suspension bridge in the world when it's finished. Now that's something I'd like to see, Daniel says, his mood shifting. Imagine walking all the way across the East River with nothing but air beneath you. The Brooklyn Bridge represented something beyond its engineering marvels. It symbolized connection, physically linking Manhattan and Brooklyn, conceptually bridging old technology and new possibilities. For immigrants especially, it embodied the American promise of overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles through human ingenuity and effort. They say 20 men have died building it already. Thomas continues, reading further. And there it was, the other side of progress. The human cost rarely mentioned in the celebratory newspaper accounts. The workers who fell from heights, who suffered caissons under the river, who paid with their bodies for each foot of advancement. As Thomas continues sharing news items, a sudden commotion in the hallway interrupts. Raised voices, a door slamming, then the unmistakable sound of Mrs. Kowalski's coughing, now with a wet, rattling quality that makes everyone in the Murphy apartment fall silent. Margaret makes the sign of the cross almost unconsciously. They all recognize that sound, its consumption in its later stages, when the lungs begin to fail in earnest, when the end is no longer a distant possibility, but an approaching certainty. First thing tomorrow, Daniel says quietly. Thomas, you'll go find the O'Malley boy before your paper route. Thomas nods solemnly. Yes, Pa. The evening continues with work punctuated by conversation, but the reminder of Mrs. Kowalski's illness casts a shadow over the room. This, too, was part of tenement life, the constant proximity to suffering and death, the reminder of your own vulnerability, the knowledge that the same fate could easily befall your own family. Around 8:30, a welcome distraction arrives in the form of music drifting through the open window. Someone in the building has produced a fiddle and is playing folk tunes in the courtyard below. Soon other instruments join, a penny whistle, a small accordion, improvised percussion on upturned buckets. Ukrainian music, Grandmother Murphy identifies, her foot tapping slightly to the rhythm. Similar to our own jigs in some ways, the music grows as more neighbors emerge from their apartments to listen or join in. Even in the crushing poverty of the tenements, people found ways to create beauty and community. Music, storytelling, shared celebrations of births, marriages, religious holidays. These weren't luxuries, but necessities, reminders of humanity in dehumanizing conditions. Daniel moves to the window, looking down at the impromptu gathering. Sarah, would you like to go down for a little while? The girl's face lights up. These rare moments of leisure are precious, especially in summer when the courtyard becomes a communal living room for the building's residents. Can I, Ma? She asks, already knowing Margaret will be reluctant. Work first, Margaret says. Margaret, surprised he remembers such details after brief interaction. Yes, I'm documenting daily life here, he explains, gesturing to his camera. These images will accompany articles about tenement conditions, perhaps eventually a book. And what good will that do us? The question comes out more directly than Margaret intended, but she doesn't retract it. Reese seems taken aback by her forthrightness. Well, to create change, people must first understand the conditions. My photographs show what words alone cannot convey. It's a reasonable answer, but Margaret has heard similar promises before. Reporters come, politicians occasionally visit during campaign seasons, charity organizations conduct surveys. Yet the fundamental conditions remain unchanged. Too many people in too little space, paying too much rent for too few services, working too many hours for too little pay. I hope you show the dignity as well as the difficulty, she says finally. We may be poor, but we're not simply objects of pity. Reese studies her with new interest. A fair point, Mrs. Murphy. I'll keep it in mind. With a nod, Margaret continues into the building. The stairwell is cooler than outside, a small mercy as she begins the climb to the 5th floor. The familiar scents and sounds of the tenement greet her. Aromas from various ethnic traditions, children playing on landings, multilingual conversations flowing from open doorways. On the 3rd floor landing, she encounters Mrs. Abramowitz coming, down with a bundle of soiled linens from the Kowalski apartment. The older woman's face is grim. Not good, she says simply. The bleeding has started. Margaret crosses herself automatically. Bloody coughing is a near final stage of consumption when the lungs begin to disintegrate in earnest. I'll come up, after I check on Mother Murphy and Sarah. Mrs. Abramowitz nods and continues downward with her burden. The community care network is fully activated now, women taking turns sitting with Mrs. Kowalski, cleaning what needs cleaning, preparing what food might be acceptable to someone too ill to feel hunger. At her own apartment, Margaret finds Sarah and Grandmother Murphy already preparing for the evening's work. The vegetables for soup simmer on the small stove. Clean laundry hangs from a line strung across one corner of the room. The table is cleared for the piecework that will occupy their evening hours. Thomas came home for a few minutes, Sarah reports. Said he'd be late tonight, too. Extra papers because of railroad strike news. Margaret nods, unsurprised. Her son has a good head for business, understanding how to capitalize on public interest in breaking news. And how is Mrs. Kowalski fading? Grandmother Murphy says bluntly. Priest came this afternoon, last rites. The information lands heavily. Despite knowing Mrs. Kowalski's condition was grave, the finality of last rites makes the approaching loss concrete. Another neighbor soon to join the too-long list of tenement residents claimed by disease, their absence marked by black crepe on a door before life necessarily continues for everyone else. Sarah's expression reflects her struggle to process this adult reality of death. At 12, she's old enough to understand what's happening, but young enough to still be disturbed by its inevitability. Will she go to heaven? She asks, the child's question cutting through adult prevarication. Of course she will, Grandmother Murphy answers without hesitation. Suffering in this life is rewarded in the next, and who has suffered more patiently than Mrs. Kowalski? It's the tenement theology, a belief system adapted to make sense of disproportionate hardship. If this life is characterized by inequality and injustice, then surely the next must balance the scales. Without such faith, how could anyone continue day after day? Margaret sets down her basket containing the new piecework. I'll go sit with her for a while. Start on these when you've eaten. As she crosses the hall to the Kowalski apartment, Margaret mentally prepares herself for what awaits. She's no stranger to sick rooms or death watches, having performed this neighborly duty many times in both Ireland and America. Still, each vigil requires its own gathering of strength, its own steeling against the intimate witnessing of another's pain. Inside, the Kowalski apartment mirrors the Murphys in layout, but feels entirely different in atmosphere. The heavy stillness of serious illness has transformed the space. The air smells of sickness, attempted remedies, and the particular sweet-sour odor that accompanies late tuberculosis. Mrs. Kowalski lies on the bed, her once substantial frame now skeletal beneath a thin sheet, despite the summer heat. Her breathing comes in shallow gasps, occasionally interrupted by weak coughing that produces pinkish phlegm. Mr. Kowalski sits beside her, his large workman's hand looking incongruously gentle as it holds her much smaller one. He looks up at Margaret's entrance, nodding acknowledgement but not speaking. Words have become superfluous in this room, where the most important conversation is now between his wife and God. Margaret moves quietly to the other side of the bed, taking up a position that allows her to assist if needed without intruding on the couple's intimacy. From her apron pocket, she produces a small rosary and begins silently moving through the familiar prayers, the beads sliding through work-worn fingers. Through the open window comes the sound of the city continuing its business. Carriage wheels on cobblestones, children playing, vendors calling their wares, factory whistles marking shift changes, life persisting in all its varieties. While, in this small room, one particular life approaches its conclusion. Time moves differently in a death vigil. Minutes stretch like hours, yet hours collapse into moments. Margaret loses track of how long she's been sitting beside Mrs. Kowalski. The rosary beads warm in her hand, prayers flowing without conscious thought. Mr. Kowalski hasn't moved, his large frame hunched protectively over his wife's diminished form. The room grows dimmer as evening approaches, shadows lengthening across the worn floorboards. Neither of them moves to light a lamp. The darkness feels appropriate somehow, a gentle veil drawing across a life approaching its end. A soft knock at the door breaks the stillness. Mrs. Abramowitz enters with a fresh, damp cloth, wordlessly taking the used one from the bedside table. She glances at Mrs. Kowalski, crosses herself in the orthodox manner, and shares a look of understanding with Margaret before departing. These small gestures of community care continue throughout the evening, women from various apartments bringing clean linens, broth that won't be consumed, prayers in different languages but identical intent. The tenement functions as a single organism in times of crisis, each cell performing its role without need for coordination. As darkness settles fully over the room, Mrs. Kowalski's breathing changes, becoming more irregular. Mr. Kowalski tenses, his hand tightening around his wife's. Margaret leans forward slightly, recognizing the pattern from previous deathbeds she's attended. Hannah, Mr. Kowalski whispers, using his wife's first name, perhaps for the first time in Margaret's hearing. The intimacy of it feels almost intrusive to witness. Mrs. Kowalski's eyes flutter open briefly, finding her husband's face in the dim light. Her lips move, forming words too quiet to hear. But Mr. Kowalski nods as if understanding. A final communication between partners who have shared the journey from old country to new, from youth to middle age, from hope to hardship, and back again. Then, with a soft exhale that sounds almost like relief, Mrs. Kowalski is gone. The labored breathing stops. The room grows profoundly still. Margaret murmurs the final prayer for the dead. The words familiar from too many similar moments. Mr. Kowalski doesn't move, still holding his wife's hand as if unwilling to acknowledge the severed connection. After allowing him a few minutes of private grief, Margaret rises quietly. "I'll tell the others," she says softly. "Take the time you need." He nods without looking up, a man suddenly alone in a country where his language is still foreign, his customs strange, his place uncertain. The particular cruelty of immigrant death, passing away far from ancestral lands, traditional mourning practices adapted to new circumstances, burial in unfamiliar soil. In the hallway, Margaret encounters Sarah waiting anxiously. "Is she?" "Yes, love. She's at peace now." Margaret draws her daughter close, feeling the girl's slight frame against her own. "Run down and tell Mrs. Abramowitz. She'll know what needs doing." As Sarah hurries off on this solemn errand, Margaret returns to her own apartment. Grandmother Murphy looks up from her sewing, reading the news in her daughter-in-law's expression. "God rest her soul," the older woman says, making the sign of the cross. "Poor Kowalski, a widower in a strange land." "The women will organize everything," Margaret says, taking up her own piecework. "Funeral society will handle the burial. Father Donovan will say, 'Mass.'" This matter-of-fact approach to death might seem callous to modern sensibilities, but in the tenements, grief was a luxury few could afford for long. Life demanded continuation. Work couldn't wait for mourning to complete its course. The practical arrangements of death required immediate attention, even as emotional processing was necessarily delayed. The two women work in silence for a while, their needles moving rhythmically through fabric. Outside, darkness has fully claimed the city, though night is a relative concept in tenement districts. The streets remain active with evening commerce, socializing, and the movements of those who work night shifts in factories, theaters, and restaurants. Eventually, Sarah returns, her young face solemn with the responsibility of her errand. Mrs. Abramowitz is telling everyone. They're preparing Mrs. Kowalski now. She takes her place at the table, picking up her own portion of the piecework. "Did you eat?" Margaret asks, the practical question of motherhood. Sarah nods. "Some soup. I saved plenty for you and Pa." The mention of Daniel reminds Margaret of his labor meeting tonight. She glances at the small clock on the shelf. Nearly 8, and no sign of him or Thomas. 2 empty places at the table. 2 men in her life navigating the wider world with its opportunities and dangers. Imagine that for a second. Your husband's at a potentially dangerous labor meeting. Your teenage son is working late on city streets known for gang activity and violence. And you just have to keep sewing, keep functioning, keep the household running with no way to check on them. No way to know they're safe until they walk through the door. The women continue their work. The room quiet except for the occasional direction from Margaret about a particular stitch or design element. Though Sarah is only 12, her sewing skills are already considerable, a necessary accomplishment for working-class girls who will depend on such domestic abilities for both employment and household management. Around 9:00, the door opens to admit Thomas, his newspaper bag empty but his expression troubled. "Everything sold," he reports, placing his earnings on the table for the family accounting. "People buying multiple copies of the evening edition. Railroad strike news has everyone talking." "Your father?" Margaret asks. "Haven't seen him." Thomas helps himself to the soup kept warm on the stove. "There's police all over the east side tonight, watching workers' gathering places." Margaret's hands still momentarily before resuming their steady rhythm. Police presence near labor discussions often signaled potential conflict. Management informing on worker meetings, authorities preparing to intervene if talk turned to action. "Mrs. Kowalski?" Thomas asks, noticing the unusual quiet in the building where news of death would normally trigger more visible activity. "Gone about an hour ago," Grandmother Murphy answers. "Women are with her now. Funeral likely day after tomorrow, depending on when the society can arrange it." Thomas nods, processing this expected but still impactful news. Death was a familiar visitor in the tenements, but familiarity didn't negate its effect, just altered how it was expressed and accommodated. "Mr. Kowalski will need help with rent now," he observes practically. "Maybe some of us men could contribute a few cents each week." This suggestion, coming from a 16-year-old, demonstrates how thoroughly tenement children absorb the community, ethics of mutual support, no formal instruction needed. They learned by watching adults create systems of reciprocal aid that made survival possible. The evening continues with work and subdued conversation. Margaret shares news from the garment workshop, the expansion, the potential jobs. Thomas describes fragments of conversations he overheard while selling papers, speculation about the railroad strike, rumors of potential federal intervention, debates about the labor movement's growing power. Through it all, they maintain awareness of Daniel's continued absence. No one mentions worry directly, but it manifests in Margaret's occasional glances toward the door, in Thomas's slightly distracted responses, in Grandmother Murphy's more frequent prayers. Around 10, activity increases in the hallway. People, coming and going from the Kowalski apartment, murmured conversations, practical arrangements being made. The tenement's death protocols in action, a choreography developed through necessity and repetition. "I should help," Margaret says, setting aside her sewing. Death duties were primarily women's domain in most immigrant cultures. The washing and dressing of the body, the preparation of the apartment for visitors, the organization of food for mourners. "I'll finish this piece first," Grandmother Murphy says, indicating the nearly completed shirtwaist in her hands. "Then I'll help, too." Margaret crosses the hall, entering the transformed Kowalski apartment. Women from throughout the building move with quiet efficiency, performing tasks according to unspoken assignments. Mrs. Abramowitz and an Italian woman from the second floor wash Mrs. Kowalski's body. 2 Polish women prepare traditional foods in the small kitchen area. Others clean the apartment, arrange furniture to accommodate visitors, place religious items appropriately. Mr. Kowalski sits in a corner, simultaneously central to and separate from these activities. Custom dictates his non-participation in this women's work. Yet his presence is essential. The chief mourner, the anchor for the rituals being enacted. Margaret joins the work naturally, taking up the task of sewing a simple shroud. The fabric, plain, white cotton, has appeared as if by magic, contributed from someone's limited stores. This too is part of the tenement support system. Materials manifesting when needed, their source often anonymous, the giving as matter-of-fact as the receiving. As the women work, they share stories about Mrs. Kowalski, her exceptional strudel, her kindness to new building residents, her beautiful singing voice before the illness took hold. This informal eulogy, spoken in a blend of languages with translations offered as needed, constructs a communal memory that will persist after individual recollections fade. "She helped me when my Yakov was born," Mrs. Finkelstein recalls. "Sat with me 3 nights when the labor wouldn't progress. Knew exactly what to do when the midwife gave up. Taught my girls to make proper pierogi," Mrs. Wisniewski adds. "Said every woman should know her homeland's food, even in America." "Remember how she decorated her window at Christmas?" Mrs. O'Brien contributes. "Paper stars she cut herself, so delicate, made the whole courtyard view nicer." These testimonials, offered while hands remain busy with practical tasks, represent the tenement version of formal memorial services. No printed programs, no written obituaries, just the oral tradition of remembrance, passing woman to woman, building to building, eventually becoming part of the collective memory of the neighborhood. Around 11 Sawan, a disturbance from the street draws attention. Raised voices, running footsteps, the distinctive sound of police whistles. The women pause in their work, exchanging concerned glances. "The labor meeting, maybe," Mrs. Abramowitz suggests quietly. "My Boris said there was one tonight near Tompkins Square." Margaret moves to the window, straining to see into the darkness below. The street lanterns provide insufficient illumination to identify individuals, but she can make out a group of men hurrying past, followed at some distance by police officers. Her stomach tightens with familiar anxiety. Daniel could be among those men, potentially identified by police as a labor organizer or agitator. The consequences could range from minor, a night in jail, a warning, to severe, loss of employment, blacklisting, even deportation in extreme cases. She returns to her work, hands steady despite her inner turmoil. This, too, is part of tenement life, maintaining outward functionality while internally processing fears too numerous to acknowledge openly. The ability to compartmentalize, to continue necessary tasks while uncertainty looms, represented a crucial survival skill for immigrant women especially. The next hour passes in continued preparation of Mrs. Kowalski's body and apartment. More, neighbors arrive to pay respects, some bringing small food offerings despite their own limited resources. Mr. Kowalski receives these visits with dignified gratitude, his grief temporarily structured by the formal rituals of death. Shortly after, midnight, Margaret hears familiar footsteps on the stairs. Daniel's distinctive tread, slower than usual, perhaps indicative of exhaustion or injury. She excuses herself from the Kowalski apartment and steps into the hallway just as her husband reaches their landing. In the dim light, she can see that his clothing is disheveled and there's a darkening bruise on his cheekbone. He looks simultaneously defeated and defiant, a combination she's seen before in moments of significant setback. "You're hurt," she says simply. "It's nothing." He glances toward the Kowalski apartment, noting the unusual activity. "Mrs. Kowalski?" "About 3 hours ago." Peaceful at the end. Daniel nods, processing this expected news. "Poor Kowalski. We should help with expenses." "Already being arranged." Margaret studies her husband's face, reading the signs of whatever transpired tonight. "The meeting?" Daniel shakes his head slightly, indicating this isn't the place for that discussion. 2. Many ears, too many potential informants, even among sympathetic neighbors. Labor talk remained dangerous territory, especially after some kind of confrontation had clearly occurred. They enter their apartment to find Thomas waking up despite the late hour, his expression relieving slightly at the sight of his father. Grandmother Murphy has fallen asleep in her chair, her unfinished sewing still in her lap. Sarah's small form is curled on her pallet, though Margaret suspects she's awake and listening.
"You should have been sleeping hours ago," Daniel tells his son, the gentle reprimand carrying no real force. "Wanted to make sure you got home all right," Thomas responds, his eyes taking in his father's disheveled appearance and bruised face.
"Heard there was trouble near Tompkins Square." Daniel moves to the water basin, washing his face and hands before speaking again. The familiar ritual seems to help him transition from whatever occurred outside to the relative safety of home. "Meeting was productive until the end," he says finally, his voice low. "Good turnout. Representatives from 5 factories. Discussion of reasonable demands. 10-hour day, safer conditions, fair payment schedules." He pauses, checking that Sarah appears asleep before continuing. Then someone, a plant from management, probably, started talking about property damage, sabotage. Police were waiting outside. Seemed like they knew exactly when to move in. The familiar pattern of labor suppression in the 1880s. Infiltration of meetings, provocation toward more, radical action, police intervention justified by threats to public order. The system well designed to undermine legitimate organizing efforts. "Anyone arrested?" Thomas asks. "Some. I got away in the confusion. Others weren't so lucky." Daniel's expression darkens. "Fitzgerald from my department was taken. Has 3 children and a wife expecting another. The name hangs in the air. Fitzgerald, the man who lost 3 fingers recently and received no compensation. His arrest likely means termination from the ironworks, potential blacklisting from other factories, a family suddenly without income." "We'll help them," Margaret says simply. "Just as the tenement community mobilizes for illness and death, it will respond to this different kind of crisis. Food will appear at the Fitzgerald door. Children will be looked after while Mrs. Fitzgerald seeks whatever work she can find in her condition. Men will make inquiries about potential jobs at factories without blacklist connections." Daniel nods, accepting this as given. Then, with clear reluctance, he shares the most consequential news. "Harrison was there himself, saw me clearly. The implication is immediate and severe. Mr. Harrison, the ironworks owner, personally witnessing Daniel at a labor meeting almost certainly means termination, possibly as soon as tomorrow. The family's primary income source now in jeopardy." Margaret absorbs this information without visible reaction, her mind already calculating adjustments. Which expenses can be eliminated? Which possessions might be sold? Which additional work opportunities might be pursued? This rapid adaptation to changing circumstances, this refusal to waste energy on recrimination or despair, characterized immigrant resilience in the face of constant precarity. "I've been thinking," Thomas says into the heavy silence. "Ali mentioned the shipping office is hiring down at the harbor, loading manifests, keeping track of cargo. They want someone who can write clearly and do figures. The suggestion carries multiple implications. Thomas has been considering more stable employment than newspaper selling. He's been making inquiries without mentioning them to his parents. He's prepared to take on more financial responsibility if his father loses his position. At 16, he's thinking with the strategic planning of an adult provider." Daniel studies his son, recognizing the maturity behind the casual suggestion. "Office work. With your schooling, you could qualify. Pay's not as good as the ironworks," Thomas acknowledges, "but it's steady and inside work, not so hard on the body." The unspoken comparison hangs between them. The contrast between Daniel's physically demanding labor, with its toll visible in his calloused hands and numerous small burns, and the potential for Thomas to earn a living through clerical skills, rather than physical exertion. "Something to consider," Daniel says finally. But not tonight. Too late for such discussions. The family prepares for sleep, moving through their evening routine with the efficiency born of limited space and long practice. Daniel checks on Sarah, confirming she's genuinely asleep now, her breathing deep and regular. Margaret helps Grandmother Murphy from her chair to her sleeping place. Thomas arranges his pallet near the door. As they settle into their respective sleeping spots, the sounds of the tenement at night surround them. Distant conversations, a baby crying several floors below, the creak of the building settling, occasional footsteps in the hallway as the activities around Mrs. Kowalski's death continue through the night. Daniel lies awake, despite his evident exhaustion, staring at the ceiling, barely visible in the darkness. Margaret can sense his wakefulness, the tension in his body revealing the thoughts cycling through his mind. Concern about potential job loss, calculation of family needs, consideration of limited options, weighing of principles against pragmatism. "Sleep," she whispers, reaching across the small space between them to touch his arm. "Tomorrow will come regardless." His hand finds hers, squeezing gently in acknowledgement. This simple contact, this physical affirmation of partnership, carries more meaning than extended conversation. They've weathered crises before. They will weather this one too, whatever form it takes. Gradually, Daniel's breathing deepens as sleep claims him despite his worries. Margaret remains awake a while longer, her mind moving methodically through contingency plans. If Daniel loses his position, Thomas might pursue the shipping office job. She could seek more hours at the garment workshop when it expands next month. Sarah is young, but capable of taking on additional piecework at home. Grandmother Murphy's arthritis is worse, but she can still manage some contribution to family income. They will survive, not comfortably, not easily, but they will continue. This certainty, this fundamental faith in their collective capacity to endure, underlies all other considerations. It's not optimism exactly, more a hard-earned confidence in their ability to adapt, to sacrifice, to find paths forward when obstacles arise. As midnight passes into early morning, the tenement gradually quiets. The women completing Mrs. Kowalski's preparation depart for their own apartments. The street noises diminish as even the night workers and revelers seek rest. For a few precious hours, the relentless pace of tenement life slows, allowing its exhausted residents brief respite before dawn arrives to begin the cycle anew. Margaret finally surrenders to sleep. Her last conscious thoughts not of tomorrow's potential hardships, but of the shipping office job Thomas mentioned. Office work. Clean, respectable employment using mind rather than muscle. A first step toward the better future that brought them to America in the first place. This ultimately was the immigrant dream. Not personal advancement necessarily, but the opening of doors for the next generation. The chance for children to climb higher than their parents could, to have choices beyond mere survival. Even in the darkest moments, this dream sustained them, providing purpose to hardship and meaning to sacrifice. Outside, the night watchman calls the hour. 2 o'clock and all is well. The irony of the traditional call goes unremarked in the sleeping tenement. All is not well. Not with Mrs. Kowalski lying dead across the hall. Not with Daniel facing likely termination. Not with thousands of families crowded into unsafe buildings, working dangerous jobs, living constantly on the edge of disaster. Yet in another sense, perhaps the watchman speaks a deeper truth. In the connection between neighbors supporting each other through crisis, in the dignity maintained despite undignified conditions, in the small acts of kindness and community that make survival possible, in the stubborn hope that propels people forward, despite overwhelming evidence for despair. For the Murphy family and countless others like them, this paradox defined life in 1880s America. A simultaneous recognition of profound injustice alongside persistent faith in potential improvement. The ability to see clearly the harsh realities of their circumstances without surrendering to them. The courage to continue building something meaningful within systems designed to extract maximum labor for minimum compensation. As the Murphys sleep, the city continues its restless evolution around them. New telegraph lines being installed, electrical systems expanding, railroads pushing ever westward, industrial innovations emerging from countless workshops and laboratories. The machinery of progress grinding forward, powered by the labor of those who benefit from it least. Yet even in sleep, the Murphys remain part of this transformation, not just as cogs in its mechanisms, but as conscious participants shaping its direction through their daily choices, their community bonds, their insistence on dignity, their quiet but determined resistance to dehumanization. In this way, while seemingly powerless individually, collectively, they help determine what kind of nation America will become, its values, its social structures, its definition of community and responsibility. Their impact extends far beyond their awareness, influencing a future they can barely imagine, but nonetheless help create.